Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Namita Wahi. I'm a senior fellow here at the Center for Policy Research. And on behalf of the center, I'm very pleased to welcome all of you to this talk by Professor Shareen Joshi on courts as environmental watchdogs, big data and AI analysis of 4 decades of Indian litigation. To introduce Professor Joshi, she is an associate professor of international development at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service and also a senior fellow at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Her PhD is in economics from Yale University, and she also has a BA in mathematics economics from Reed College in the United States. Her research has focused on inequality, human capital investment, and grassroots collective action in South Asia. And she has published her work extensively in the areas of development economics, population studies, environmental studies, and gender studies. She has previously served as a consultant for the World Bank, the United Nations, the Hewlett Foundation, the Government of India, the Government of Rajasthan, and several nonprofit organizations. And she's here with us to share very interesting findings from a research study that she has done involving over 12,000 cases, environmental law cases using AI. So we are very, very happy to have you here to talk to us about your cutting edge research on issues that are particularly relevant from like not just a national climate perspective, but also an international climate perspective. Only yesterday, the International Court of Justice has actually upheld climate responsibility of nations to each other, which is a big thing in the movement of environmental jurisprudence in the international sphere. Whereas all over the world, but particularly in India, but also uh, we are and we have been dealing with environmental issues. We are here, during the monsoon season in India, and there's been a lot of concerns about changing rain patterns, which is causing flooding and drying, and so many severe environmental impacts of the development paradigm that we've all been part of. So against this backdrop and the immediacy of the crisis, which has been recognized by the International Court of Justice after very serious efforts by the countries that are going to suffer most from climate devastation in the near future, in the spirit of shared responsibility for planet Earth, I welcome you to come and share with us your findings from this research and how we can better protect the environment through courts and otherwise.
Thank you. Thank you to all of you for, inviting me. It's 3:30 in the afternoon. You've probably traveled in the heat or post lunch. So I'll launch into this with a scenario, right? And I'll say the topic I'm presenting on today is near and dear to my heart. I'm native to Delhi. A huge fan of CPR, have always dreamt of coming here to present my work. So I'm really, really excited to be here. So, all right, a scenario, right? Like, let's think about what I'm going to say today. Imagine you live close to the Yamuna River. This is not a big stretch for most of you here, right? The Yamuna River is not far from here. You wake up and you find the river running black and gross, right? And it happened. I remember the toxic foam and, So you're in a community that's pretty upset by this, and you have a very savvy environmental lawyer who's like, we're going to do something about it. Collective action, that's what I used to study. It does happen, right? A bunch of people get together, a lawyer goes and say, we're going to do something about this, and you file a case against a cluster or an individual firm that is producing this toxicity, right? So you do it, you feel good. This obviously doesn't happen instantly, it takes some time. And then you start watching the river. What I'm going to try and argue to you today is you actually feel pretty good about your effort. The river does feel better or look better, and it is better. The worst pollution level on the worst days will go down by 25%. And you'll be thinking, I didn't make the world pollution free, but I did do something for my community, right? So this is a real, this is the way it works. The issue that I'm going to try and convince you of is your joy lasts, or your pride lasts a couple of years. You feel good for a couple of years, but a couple of years after you do this, you'll wake up one day and the river will be black. Right? So what am I going to try to the story that I'm going to try to bring out through the data and through some other work is courts do good things. Courts can function as environmental watchdogs in a country where the executive and the legislature have not been able to fully curb, environmental toxicity. But the problem is they can't go all the way and they can't find a sustainable long-term solution, because for enforcement, we're back to the executive and the legislature. So the story that will emerge, I'm an economist, forgive me for how much data my profession demands I analyze before I can tell a story like this. But that is very much the story. And it could be any of us, right? As I said, I'm native to Delhi. I've worked in communities on the other side of the Yamuna. This could be anyone's story. You don't need data for it, but to prove it takes some work. So, all right. So, what are we going to do here? Sorry, am I doing? Can I try again? Okay. So, I'm going to build on a recent paper. If you're brave enough to go read this paper, you're in for like some 89-page econometric delight, right? But it's called Environmental Litigation as Scrutiny, a 4-decade analysis of justice, firms, and pollution in India. And before I go any further, I should say a lot of my work is co-authored. My team is truly a global team. Sandeep is in Bangalore. Daniel is and he consults for the World Bank. Daniel is a professor of economics at Toulouse University in France. Peter Nice graduated from Toulouse University in France and is a postdoc. Shashank is from here and he's starting at Berkeley this fall, right, in the PhD program. We had never met. We all met fortuitously in lockdown in the pandemic, and we started this project, at that time. And this is how long it takes to write an economics paper, right? That's good news and bad news for those of you in the room. Some ongoing work, and this is where that number of 12,000 cases comes from. Since we wrote the big economics paper, we've scraped all the 12,500 or so, 600 or so case environmental court orders that have been issued in India over about 5 decades. And we've run them through human eyes, right? About 3,000 of them have been read by humans. And then we've had AI models read these to predict which ones are green. And our dream is to look at the impact of green rulings on air pollution and water pollution in India. But we're not all the way there yet. But I'll talk about this work some more if I get time at the end. But the starting point of our research is a topic that all of you at CPR or on Zoom at CPR, or, via Zoom today probably already know. India's got pretty high pollution levels, right? Like if you trust IQ Air, if you trust U Chicago, whatever data you use, a very large number of whatever the number of polluted cities will end up being in India. Delhi, we love it. It's, my home city. And it's pretty devastating that it's always ranking among the world's most polluted capital cities, right? I think we all know, I don't need to quote Greenstone Hannah and the literature since Greenstone Hannah, but traditional, India's got 200 plus laws on the books, right? The laws exist. Enforcement has been quite limited, and we can talk about that some more in Q&A. Courts have emerged as environmental activists. And here, I was really guided by the work, and I have to thank Shibani Ghosh, who about 5 years ago, or just before the pandemic, we had a Zoom call and really kind of educated me. And then her book, it was a huge education to me as well. But the timeline of how courts in India have stepped in as environmental activists, I think, is super interesting. I think the story really begins after the Bhopal gas tragedy and the emergence of PIL litigation in India. And I'll show you some of the numbers from our research, right? But some really important things about Indian environmental law. Rock star lawyers like MC Mehta, who I had the good fortune of visiting at his house in Delhi some years ago. Um, Supreme Court interventions, judges who really took on the hard slog of going through very technical cases on air pollution, water pollution. You remember the CNG case in Delhi. And then, of course, the creation of the National Green Tribunal, right, which we can talk more about later on as well. So you can see I'm seeding the questions. There's some hard questions I don't want to answer right now, but I'll answer later. So against this policy backdrop, which again, I know many of you are familiar with, the real policy question we're asking is, can the judiciary be a substitute for I won't say failure, but a weakness in the regulator and the executive branch of government? Can the judiciary step out from that shadow? All right. So let's jump into what we did, right? So the first thing, for the purpose of the next 20 minutes or so, maybe 25, I'm not going to focus on all environmental orders. I'm going to focus on just the Water Act of 1974, right? The water toxicity. That is still the steel frame that regulates surface water in India. So we scraped Indian Qanun and we cross-validated with other court websites. Over the pandemic, we became good at getting through the captchas and scraping. We got 78 court orders that specifically cited the Water Act from the Supreme Court, High Court, and Green Tribunals. This is 978 after we take out all the very small orders. This case is adjourned, this course, the case is transferred, not those. These are real orders. We then take data from the CPCB. We have another data set, the WRIS, which we can talk about also. I think we didn't use it in the paper. We cross-validated our results with it. But we take the pollution readings from 2,865 pollution monitors. I think they started gathering data around 1990. Then, because we got asked by economists, what's the economics question here? We have financial data from firms that are mentioned in the environmental cases. So typically, if a firm is polluting, citizens have taken the firm to court. We know that firm's identity from the case. Then we looked for them in prowess. I thought this would be a wild goose chase. Look at the size of India, look at the scale of India. Turns out it wasn't. I was completely wrong. We get about, I think, 400 cases that mention firms, and of those 400 cases, we found about 100 of them in prowess. Take that's either a small number or big number, depending on what your ex ante prior was. For me, it's like, wow, I thought we'd be zero. But the next thing we did was try to look at impacts on infant mortality. For there, we relied on NFHS data that covers the time period of which we're studying. This is an area of interest to me. I've got another paper, which I'll talk about in a bit, where I look at the impact of the closure of tanneries on the Ganga River on infant mortality. And in that paper with Tuan Do and Sam Stolper, we had actually found that the shutting down of tanneries reduced infant mortality 60 kilometers away temporarily, but that's not trivial. That pollution human health relationship is super interesting, right? So okay, so what's the innovation we do here? And I'll get to this some more, but just to give it away, for every case, right? So we have 978 court orders. We know who are the judges in those orders. We know who wrote those judges, or who wrote those orders, who are the judges. So we looked for the judge, and then we went back to the corpus of cases, and that is not 12,000, that's 7 million cases, right? So if we hear like Sushant Jha, right? Judge Sushant Jha has written an environmental order. We are able to find Sushant Jha by matching him to the court in which he wrote the order, and then finding, his biographical information, and then seeing what other orders did Sushant Jha write in his career. so we can get into the head of judges, right? Because we're trying to figure out what happens when there's a green verdict. But a green verdict doesn't come randomly, right? A judge writes the green verdict. So are there green judges? Are there green judges? We were super, interested, and there are green judges. They're not, strangely enough, there are not a lot of repeat judges in our sample. I think water toxicity is a very niche area of environmental law. You don't have a lot of judges who are like, but we only do environmental, water toxicity cases. Not the case. There's a big distribution of lawyers and judges, and we find quite a lot of one case. I think most 90% of our sample is either under three, right? The judges have heard under show up less than three times. So then what we do is we basically say, suppose we assume that the allocation of judges to cases is random. And maybe it's not, but for the first allocation, we think it is. See, in India, in a court, we've all lived in India, right? If you don't like the judge you've been assigned, you can stall, you can delay, you can not show up, you can handshake with the other person that will wait, we'll finish the summer vacation, we'll wait till a judge retires. All fair game, but not the first assignment, right? The judge is assigned, and then you can try those games later on. So we're looking at first assignment, right? Which is as good as random. So what we try to do is we try to predict who gets a green ruling. If I'm living in, one of the districts in next to the Yamuna, a community files a case. I don't get to control who is the judge. That judge is as good as random for me, right? And the fact that he or she will rule green, I can predict based on their past, right? So I'm trying to exploit that variation. So, all right, that's the kind of overview of our approach. I'll come back to that and give you detail, but for now, I want to show you the data, right? I want to be careful when I say all India. I really don't mean all India because this is river pollution, surface water pollution. And we don't have monitors in every single district of India. We have monitors where there's sufficient river or surface. Like my home state of Rajasthan is almost completely white because there's not a lot of surface water, and there's certainly not a lot of monitoring of surface water over there, right? You see it definitely in Punjab, definitely in the north, and then throughout South India, right? Which makes sense. That's where the rivers are. If you look on the right, those are our pollution cases. When we first began this, I was convinced that pollution cases would only be in Delhi, Calcutta, Chennai, and Bangalore, right? Or maybe Gujarat also. Not true. These are cases all over. We had to be careful. We had to read the case and figure out where did it have jurisdiction. So we've assigned to every case its jurisdiction, but even then, we don't have full coverage of India. So the way you should think about this research is it pertains to districts where there are cases. Not every district of India is fighting water pollution. Some themes in our cases, right? So you probably can't see the text too much, but I'll give you a sense of what's up there. You can see this is what a lot of people have talked about, and certainly Shivani Ghosh's book didn't have these numbers, but she makes this argument that water pollution was non-existent, or water pollution jurisprudence, or water pollution contestations in the courts of India were pretty much non-existent till about 1980. It's really in the 1980s that you start to see environmental movements in India emerge and take themselves to the courts, right? Environmental movements have existed long before that. All right. It's an interesting thing. I don't know if it's just me thinks it's interesting. I'd be eager to know what you think. Almost all the cases feature the government, right? So, like, if we are neighbors, Namita, and I am throwing some, stuff into, we both live by a river and I'm polluting the water, you don't file a case against me. You file a case as the government for not cracking down on me.
There's an easy explanation for that, and that is because if I were to bring a case against you, I would have to do it in tort law, which
Yes.
would make it a civil dispute, which would take forever to get through the courts. But if I make it a case with the government, then it becomes a writ petition. and we go directly to the High Court.
It's so great to have Namita sitting here. That's exactly what I was going to say, right? That typically this is the preferred path to deal with environmental pollution is writ petitions, not tort, civil cases. That makes Indian, courts really different than say the US. In the US, if you are mad at me for polluting, you just file a case against me, right? And that would be equally quick to kind of resolve. That might actually be quicker. So, all right, I was worried that we have a lot of appeals, but we don't. It's not. It's about a quarter of our sample. There's a lot of mention of pollution control boards, though that's the dark black line. And, I have to say this is not perfect because it's based on keyword searches. There's no sophisticated AI machine learning. Literally, it's like, do you see the words public interest litigation or PIL? And you can see the growth in that also. I suspect that's an undercount because they don't always write PIL that this is a PIL. It's just filed as a PIL. And in the court records, there's no marker for PIL. We can't really get a body of work on just PIL because they have never categorized it separately, as far as I know. Right? Or at least in the databases that we had available to us. All right.
What were these databases?
We used Indian Qanun, but beyond that, we also used the e-courts. We used both. So we used Indian Qanun to get the, citations, but then we validated it with e-courts. For every case, who was the judge, who was the petitioner, that doesn't come from Qanun because it's not very reliable. So, and having said that, we could have missing cases. There's no doubt that 978 is, but we've cross-checked, right? So I had some students look up, play with like searches, look in newspapers, say what were the top cases in Bangalore in the year 2000, then see is it in our database. Same thing in Chennai, right? So to the extent we could, and we did find a couple ones that were missing, but we don't know the upper and lower bounds of that. So yeah, exactly. And this is part of the chaos of our record keeping with the judicial data. The leading category of, again, the themes of the cases, it's firms, right? Like Indian environmental jurisprudence seems to be dominated by the citizen versus the firm. Citizens getting really angry that firms are polluting is the dominant theme. Permits were a very big theme. They explicitly talk about toxicity, fines, arguments about human health. There's a lot of emphasis on the Ganga River in our popular consciousness, but yet when you look at the actual corpus of cases, the Ganga River cases are not dominating. It's actually South India is where. And by the way, we have a separate paper we're writing, right? That a lot of the attention of pollution is on the north and particularly Delhi. And the weight of environmental litigation, the case load is way higher in the south, right? So Kerala in particular, Tamil Nadu, Telangana, Andhra, very, very active environmental law communities, right? And maybe the correlation goes exactly the right, maybe that's why I don't know, right? But that's an interesting, I really thought Ganga River, Delhi would dominate this themes and not at all, right? So it's much more spread out than I thought it would be. All right, so just some quick flavor of our data.
Would it be because, well, two reasons. One is that Ganga, there is the National Mission for Clean Ganga. There's been a lot of efforts to clean the Ganga. And the second reason could be that most of our industries are in the south.
Could be, absolutely.
The
It
north
could
doesn't,
be.
north provides the labor to the industries in the south.
Could be, Namita, it absolutely could be. The reason my prior is I view policy as also responding to citizens, right? And given that MC Mehta versus Union of India, the first environmental water toxicity case was over the Ganga River.
Yes.
I really thought there would be a kind of, a kind of big wave of cases that would come from that. And there was, but it was not dominating the sample.
Was it that it was really successful in pushing the industries out?
No,
Okay.
it's the MC Mehta paper. I've done a separate paper on just that, and the result is largely the same. It was an effect, but it was a temporary effect, and then it went away. The Ganga River is, it keeping rivers clean is hard work all the time. The approach in India seems to be someone comes in and shakes things up and something gets better, but then, it degenerates after that. And we're all smiling.
You're talking about north and south. It's not so much about north and south. I would say it is peninsular India and hinterland.
Fair enough.
Gujarat and Maharashtra more or less aligned with the south.
Yes.
Most matter.
And definitely in matters of environmental litigation. Gujarat looks much more similar to Kerala than Delhi. Yeah, exactly. So, all right, this is a flavor of our data, right? So there's lots of different pieces of data. The top two lines are just pollution monitors defined at the level of monitor year, right? So per monitor per year. BOD max levels and COD max level. BOD is biological oxygen demand, COD is chemical oxygen demand. They're both very widely used measures of toxicity. And they are both closely watched by the government. BOD is the fail-safe. That's why you see missing COD so much, is the government of India really puts an emphasis into when they have to make a choice between what do they measure, and they can't measure everything. It says in their manual, you have to get BOD. COD can be optional. We merged that data of pollution with our cases, and out of 978 cases, we were successfully able to locate the districts around the monitor. We were able to identify the district of the case with the monitor that was pertinent to that case in 339 cases. So a lot of our work comes from there. There's another 115, I think 215 cases which were applicable everywhere, pan India, right? So that's on top of this 339. But just for this, like about a quarter of them were appeals, about a fifth of them were constitutional cases. They were kind of serious cases, right, relating to rights of people and firms and all that. Again, to Namita's point, the government is in almost all of them. There were an average of 1.7 judges. And again, this is weird and not weird at the same time. The students who read these cases, we asked them, do you give a code between -2 and 2 on your impression of pro environment? Is it going to help the environment? And the negative is like, is it going to hurt the environment? Because if it's like pro firms, pro growth, go ahead, pollute because it creates jobs and we can't afford, that then we give it that. There was no case with a -2, but there was some with -1. But we're focused more on pro environment or not. I'm not going into the minus territory because I think that's really hard to interpret. But the point I think is interesting. Only about a third of the cases were green. So the very first question that I was asking, can courts be environmental watchdogs? I found this very surprising that only a third of the court orders in our sample were actually green. Because I always thought growing up in India, especially Delhi, right, that look, courts are the last hope we have for the environment, that Indian judges, Judge Bhagwati, the PILs, that they must be, especially after Bhopal, there's an inclination to rule green. No, a third of them are green, right? That was already surprised. I've talked to a lot of people about this. They feel that that number is unfair because it really depends on where the case comes from. For example, in Goa, it's almost 100%. Right? South India, the numbers are green cases are very high. Kerala, it's like 60%. Whereas in East India, where I think there's more of a desire for development, jobs, right? Like there's much less emphasis. That I think is a separate paper that we have to write sometime, is where do judges tend to rule green? We're not looking into that as deeply here. Yeah. Yes. I don't have the district level for the simple reason that when those are uploaded, they are not always in English. if I look at just the English ones, then I will have a skewed sample. And secondly, district ones, the types of issues they're studying. Yeah, and the types of issues they're studying are more personnel related, hiring related, staffing related. This is original jurisdiction for high courts. So
Oh, what about to UP Bihar where high courts also follow Hindi? No?
yeah, no, we've got UP Bihar in here. I don't remember the numbers for green, non-green. I suspect they are more similar to Bihar, Chhattisgarh, more pro-development than pro-environment. I suspect from my memory, but I can check afterwards. At the judges, it shouldn't surprise anyone in this room that Indian judges tend to be, like in our sample, 98% men. Um, about 43% of them have, graduate level education beyond just a kind of law degree, and 16% of them have post grad education. So we were also trying to play around with that, as certain judges, who are educated in a much more broad way, more likely to be green. That's something we're going to study later on. But all right, so what are we doing in terms of our methods, right? So I already kind of explained this in an overview, but I'll give you some more details. The concern we have is like in this map, right? That look, a green order doesn't just come randomly. It's something has to create a demand for that kind of order. It's not a random occurrence. Green orders can be endogenous to pollution, whether it's like the story I started out with, right? You wake up one morning, the river's running black, you're outraged, you want to go do something about it, so you file a case and you may get a green order. So the place you woke up in beside the Yamuna River is not representative of all of India. It's just one place. And you don't want to, overinterpret. You want to kind of understand where that came from in the first place, right? But so what did I do here? The concern, I guess, is that, green court orders are endogenous to pollution. So what do we do? I know this is not an econ audience, but I'm going to dare say instrumental variables design is all right, right? Like we use the judge's writing style as an instrument for getting a green order, right? Because the argument is if a case is assigned to a judge or a judge is assigned to a case somewhat randomly at the beginning, then you can say this case and this judge matched randomly, but the history of this judge, where their mindset came from, what ideology did they bring into that room, can predict whether the case went green. And that's random from the standpoint of the citizen, right? If I wake up near the Yamuna, river's dirty, file a case, who gets assigned to that case? I didn't decide. Whether they were, a constitutionally sensitive judge is something I didn't get to pick. It came randomly, right? That's the kind of argument we're making. And in the paper, we have to do a lot of work to basically show this is valid, right? We have to basically go through relevance. The judge's writing style predicts the environmental decision. Exclusion, that the judge's writing style affects pollution only through the court decision. And again, because Indian courts, judges are transferred a lot. So you can't say that Shireen Joshi's best friend was the judge. So, their friendship also affected the pollution, the court decision. It was random. And then, yeah, we want to say that judges are randomly assigned to cases. We have to do a lot of validation. The 89 pages I told you about, a lot of it will, is quite mathematically trying to prove that there's a strong first stage. Actually, there's not a strong first stage. It's a weak first stage, but we use weak instruments test to say it's just strong enough for us to do what we want to do. We then have to show there's no pre-trends, right? And basically launch a bag of, econometric tests to kind of check this. All right, I'll skip this, but I'm going to come to some results, all right? So and by the way, we, in our econometrics, we understand that it's not just judges' writing styles. You also have to control for a whole bunch of other things. So we have district fixed effects, year fixed effects, district level characteristics. We downloaded shrug, forest cover, night lights, we throw a bag of controls into the equation, right? Yeah.
Can you explain what do you mean by writing style of judges?
All right. Then I will go back. So, okay, for every judge in our sample, right? So I gave the example of a judge. By the way, there's no judge named Sushant, Jha, but I'll just stick with this person. Um, for every judge, we pull out their entire history of writings, right? Their history of writings. So, like, if you're a judge, I know all the cases you have litigated on, and I have that stack of files, right, electronically. Then I have, your whole history. Now, the question is, how do I compare this, yours and yours? You are an individual person with a complex ideology, you are an individual with complex ideology. So there's an algorithm called Doc2Vec, right, which takes large stacks of documents. I've run this on all sorts of things. I've run this on like certain politicians' speeches, right? And what they try to do is basically tell you what words and concepts dominate. So, for example, if I run my own papers through it, right? The introduction Namita gave, collective action, gender, environment, minorities, these things kind of pop out, right? Because these are themes. And the way the computer does it is Shireen Joshi may have written on gender, Rajasthan, women's groups, and then collective action, and it realizes these concepts are connected because their themes are co-occurring together. And so it will plot these clusters of ideas together. So the Dr. Vec algorithm, it it is a 25 dimensional vector that has no logical meaning. You can't look at the numbers, it means absolutely nothing. But what this does, like the chart in front of you, is say we know from reading the cases how pro-green they were. Dark blue in these plots measures pro-green. And we've taken two of the dimensions, right, out of 25. So we're just showing you two. And you can see that the pro-green rulings or judges are clustering in one part of the graph. So it's the interpretation of that is that the terms used by pro-green kind of judges will cluster together. And we're using non-environmental cases. So the keywords will be things like, citizen rights, constitution, right to life. Or, we looked at Shibani's book and the kind of trajectory of environmental jurisprudence. We were able to pick out what themes in the Indian Constitution lends themselves to jurisprudence and identify them here. So, what are we saying? That we take judges' histories, break them down into clusters, use this completely, opaque algorithm to quantify how similar judge and a non-pro-green judge might be in this dimension of writing styles. And the validation is that all the pro-green and all the not pro-green tend to cluster together. So it suggests that there's some ideas that kind of co-integrate. Sorry, correlate. Yes.
So there might be judges who are only doing IT cases for a while, only doing family cases for a while. So it's possible that a judge might be sensitive, but just by virtue of having been on the IT roster was just writing a lot of technical judgments, but later wrote in maybe then went to the NGT, wrote an environmental judgment. So that's also a factor, I guess.
But even then, right? So firstly, that we talk about the roster system in our paper, we're well aware of it. There's no category for water pollution. It's too small, right? Like there's hardly any cases. And the second point, so you can't say as a judge to the Chief Justice, like, please give me only water pollution cases. They'll be like, there's no way, we're probably not going to get one, right? Right. So that one we're not worried about. This issue of if you've heard IT cases in your career and suddenly you're given a an environmental case, we're comfortable with. Because even if you're doing IT cases, you in writing the judgments, you'll reveal your ideology. That you're kind of pro-citizen, pro-minority, anti-establishment, you mistrust government regulations. The judge will reveal. Indian judges write extensively. These we got a lot, and you know, it was a great project for lockdown because there's some true gems in these judgments, right? Indian judges are creative, interesting. They reveal a lot about themselves. They put a lot of their souls into writing. Even a simple IT judgment or a school closure judgment or something like that, it's pretty remarkable. So yes. Sorry, I meant to ask you what rules you normally follow. It's okay to take questions as we go. Yeah, I prefer. Otherwise, you've forgotten your question by the time. Yeah.
Yeah, I can defer this for the end of the presentation as well. I just have a very small question about the algorithm. Does it look specifically for individual keywords, or do you also capture a combination of keywords to process whether the position is pro or anti? Um,
So this is not analyzing pro or anti, right? This is just saying for every judge in our corpus, look at their prior history and just quantify their style. We don't know what each dimension even means because there are so many dimensions of human thought. The computer is making that decision for us by looking at these things. The reason some dots are red and some are blue is after this is done, I've taken out two of the dimensions and I've added that. Let's see in our coding which ones were green and non-green, and the blue are clustering together. So I'm using it to validate and saying, I don't know what these two dimensions mean, but they both point to the pro-environment judges being close together. So I think we would like to think that that's a validation of our approach. It may not be, but this is a visual way. In the paper, we also show you the prediction, right? Predicting a green order on the basis of this vector, we do pretty well.
Okay, so the fact that they're clustered together is a proxy that.
That's right. That's right. It's like saying you may, do IT law and your friend might do, I don't know, land law, right? But when you both hear an environmental case, your ideologies may converge. If you're both pro environment, you brought that ideology from those other cases into this case, even though what you were doing was very different.
So we have a very engaged Zoom audience. I
Yeah.
also have some questions. Paritosh Tyagi is asking, I don't know if it is about, probably not this graph, online questions. She wants to take questions as we go along.
Yeah, may as well. More fun for all of you also.
I think it refers to the previous graph, though. Environmental impact is shown as minimum minus 1.0 and maximum as 2.0. It may kindly be explained what are the units and what these quantities indicate.
Yeah, we used a Likert scale. We asked students, read this case. If you think it's pro-environment, give it a score from 0 to 2, right? 0 means no impact, 1 means mild impact, 2 means good, proper impact. And then the same thing for, is it going to hurt the environment? We realized halfway through that this hurt side is very complicated. So when we coded the data, we just used positive, like above 0 or not. We told the students halfway through that the anti is not working. What's anti-environment, right? Pretty much everything is that. So it's hard to know.
Yeah, I think there's a follow-up question, I think by the same person. It needs to be understood that all cases decided by the courts are actually following the labor of the regulatory agencies who prosecuted the offenders or that of activists through public interest litigation.
Can I ask for, like, I don't know enough about that, right? I only know the order, the way it was written.
Right, but I think that's an interpretive thought that the person is providing. I'm also told that Shibani herself is online.
Oh, wow.
So
Shivani, Thank you
Shivani,
for all your help.
Shivani, please feel free to chime in with your thoughts at whichever point you think best. And we can, I mean, I have lots of thoughts, but why don't you continue and we
All right, I'll
get through the
continue.
presentation?
All right. Yeah.
So like, I don't think that people, just only the judgments, it's not also like maybe the judges commenting. This can be found in newspaper articles or books, etc. Is also taken into consideration. And I would like to know, like, whether or not this algorithm is updated time and time again, or if like it was updated only up to a certain way. Like, when ChatGPT was introduced, the information available over there was fully updated to 2021, right? But like whether or not it has been updated by
You're right. So we've got until 2020. You're right. If I hear your question, you're saying that when we scraped, say in 2021, even the cases from, say, 1989 could have been incompletely updated online. So we routinely run a rescrape. In fact, we did a rescrape last summer. And yes, there are some changes, but they're not significant enough to change our results. So we haven't rewritten the paper because we found 10 more cases. We've done the analysis and checked that the results are robust. In fact, it gets better. So we, because of the evolving nature of this, but we're pretty sure we've got most of the significant cases because I've had Georgetown students go through newspapers, find the leading cases in top 10 Indian cities, and we've checked that those are in our data. And some of the smaller ones we really may have missed. But when you do econometrics, there's room for that, right? Because I think as long as we didn't systematically miss, we'll be safe. It'll be noise in our sample, but I don't think it'll give us biases unless it's systematic, which you can tell me it might be, right? And it might be. So, all right. So to show you impact, right? I've distilled it into some visuals because, I don't want to torment you with 25 tables and coefficients. The results fall into a certain pattern pretty quickly. If you look at the actual paper, the pages and pages of tables could roughly make this point. That, okay, so just to review, right, 978 court orders. Each order we're viewing as a policy, a public policy in that district. So it's like we're looking at 978 event studies in a single econometric design. 978 events happening in India over a period of 20 years. But for each case, we detect 3 phases: pre-filing, during the process of litigation, because I know it, I don't think it's controversial to say our courts are not fast, right? Our average case takes about 6 to 8 years, right? So there's pre-filing, litigation, and then post decision, right? And by litigation, I mean there are orders, but they get appealed, then they go back to the courts, right? There's a like long drawn process. So these 3 phases: pre-filing, during the period of litigation, and then post. And all the results I'm going to show you are going to be similar. The results in front of you are pollution. Red is BOD logged, blue is COD logged. And by BOD, I mean the max value of BOD that's observed in the time period that we're studying, right? The max value. What's the worst the river got, right? Not the average. So, all right. Before pre-filing, there's no statistically significant difference between the units that were treated by these policies and all other units, right? So again, like once you do conditioned on there being a case, before the case was filed, you were similar to all the other districts that kind of had a case, right? Like those things that you're not special in a way. During litigation, pollution declines. Both BOD and COD decline. So what is that telling us? Like again, that story I began with, you wake up, you file your case, you go to the court, you file your case. For a couple of years, you feel pretty proud of yourself. Pollution falls. And we call this litigation a scrutiny because we feel that during the period that the case is being heard at the court, there is so much scrutiny of the polluting entity that they reduce their pollution, right? It's either media or citizen or whoever, the court as the watchdog. It's working. But look, post decision, it actually goes up. You end up worse off than you were even before. Right? And I can talk more about this. There's lots of evidence on India, Kelly Alley's work on the Ganga that basically makes this point. Here's mortality. Refiling, no difference. That's what we want, right? Because these districts should be roughly the same before the cases are filed. During the process of litigation, a very weird phenomenon that we observed is actually infant mortality goes up, not down. So we thought infant mortality would go down, but here it's going up, and we think this is like firms reduce their operations. This might very well be the economic impact, right? That kind of job losses, the loss of economic activity incrementally, but none of it is very significant, right? There's really not much happening with mortality in this period. And remember, in India, infant mortality is declining very rapidly through this period. So this is not a meaningful thing. The thing you should take away from here is green orders are really not doing anything good to mortality, right?
So can we take a few more questions on the green orders?
Yeah.
So one by Amol, is there a correlation between green judges and pro-constitutional anti-establishment judges? In other words, what types of judges are likely to be pro-environment?
Yeah, so I love that question. We couldn't answer that question in this sample because almost all our judges were appearing only once. To really answer that question, I need to go to the corpus of 12,000 all environmental cases ever heard in the courts of India. There you definitely see some green judges. I didn't bring those results today because I'm not confident that the problem there is 12,000 cases. There's a lot of judges like names like Rakesh Singh or Arun Singh. There can be multiple Rakesh Singhs, and they'll look like the same judge, but so we're working on it. But the answer to your audience members' question is yes, there are some green judges. And there are some correlations between being green and Shivani's book that talked about, the evolution of principles of environmental jurisprudence. You definitely see it. Some judges really love the term polluter pays. Some judges really love the term sustainable development. Some judges routinely cite the United Nations, and some really cite American law, right? And so you can see each judge evolving in their ideology. I don't have those figures because they're not ready, but beta versions suggest that that's true.
So related to that is a question by Vasudha, and she is asking, how do you classify a judgment as green or non-green? Because the same judgment can have aspects that are green and other aspects that are non-green. For example, the MC Mehta pollution case, which led to the closure of industries in Delhi and shifting industries to the outskirts of Delhi like Bhavana and Narela. This order can be classified as green in terms of the area where the industry was shifted from, but not green for the areas where the factories got shifted to, as the focus in the judgment was not as much on improving the technology to make it less polluting, but to shift the industries and the pollution elsewhere. How do you assess this case? Is it green or not green?
Very good question. So each case was read by two law students, and we took the median score. And in some cases, if there was a disagreement between the students, then we had a third person as a tiebreaker. And again, we took the median score. Now, to answer her specific question, I looked into this. For the Delhi, I think there was a cluster that was moved in Rajasthan, certainly in Sanganer the cluster was moved. And I looked at that specific one. Both students classified that as green. And in the notes, the answer was it's green for Sanganer. And that's the district year we're studying. It is not green for Tonk, which is, or not Tonk, Bassi, which is where it was moved. But even over there, the rulings typically that come out of the courts don't have the pollution haven description. Typically, what they'll say is the cluster of firms has to move, and in the new place, they have to adopt a common effluent treatment plant, they have to open themselves up for inspections and adopt costly technologies and stay in a particular zone, which will be constantly monitored. Now, she may be correct in saying it's still not green, but it was greener than what was there before. In Sanganer and in Bassi, we would not code it as a case at all,
Right.
which is not great. I agree. I see where she's going with it, but it would be hard for us to code it. We just don't code if it's moved there because we don't know the timeline of when it's moved there. We don't put that structure on it.
And then there's a question by Nirmal John. Have you seen a noticeable spike in green orders, particularly when it concerns cities that have become synonymous with tanneries like Ranipet in Tamil Nadu or Kanpur?
Yeah, yeah. And that's the graph I showed with firms. I can show you locations also. But yeah, we have observed that and it's in the, yeah.
And then a couple of questions from economists. One by Pankaj Kumar, who says he's an economics researcher and would like to know, why did you choose judge writing style as an instrument variable?
Oh, because it's so hard to find other things that, so writing styles for us seem to be helpful because 26 vectors is a pretty nice policy toolkit, right? It's a nice set of instruments. It's a bit, that's good. Also, the more we read of these cases, we were convinced that Indian judges are really creative. There's as Shivani said, there really wasn't one body of jurisprudence that was stuck to for the entire period. Judges were improvising, judges were learning, judges were going to international conferences and coming back. So, to answer his question as an economist, what's the ideal instrument, right? The ideal instrument is something where there's sufficient variation to predict the endogenous variable. And for us, that seemed very nice. We certainly couldn't use gender because 98% are male, right? Post-grad education. Yeah, education doesn't always drive a person's ideology. I would like to use other things like, there are city judges. And, as I was saying, if you've come from Bombay, you come from Bangalore, you're kind of much more environmentally conscious than if you come from a place where you're really hungry for development, right? So I'd like to use that, but I don't know where judges were born and where they grew up. I'd
Right.
love to know that. That would be a better instrument.
And then another question by my colleague Partho. Using your algorithm, can litigants predict how judges may rule and thus may lead to court or forum shopping?
How interesting. That's a great question. To date, there's no, I mean, I hope someone will correct me if I'm wrong, and I'd be thrilled if I was wrong, but there wasn't a kind of database of environmental court cases that was fully coded up for lawyers, judges, pro environment, jurisdiction, keywords. We stalled this research project for 3 years because I was convinced it existed for the reason that he's saying, right? That people must use this. If I was an environmental lawyer in India, heck, I would want to know this, right? Like if I'm contesting a case and a judge is coming, hearing my case, I want to know what is the statistical likelihood that I'll be successful? What terms has this judge used in their previous? I would want to go at it with that. So I was convinced this must exist, but it didn't. Now that we've done it, if we release it publicly, it could totally be used for that.
Yeah, my response to that would be that it's not that easy because unlike in the US where judges are appointed for life, that's not the case here.
True.
And because of the randomness of the rostering exercise and other things, and for the very short tenures that judges often have on a particular roster, it's not that easy to manage and how long each case takes, even as a writ petition. It won't be that easy to. So the US system and the Indian system is very different, and sort of using those lenses here might not be the best way to understand what's going on.
Yeah, and I think the economists and the audience would be sympathetic that, look, we're not high powered here, right? Like there's 978 cases. Look at my first stage, my F barely makes it to 10. If I was a lawyer using my own machine, my own little predictive algorithm, I wouldn't bet money on it that it would get it right. I think we can get it right for an economics paper over 40 years. But can I get it right for tomorrow? I don't think I have that kind of power. This is purely where academics excel and where a practical person can say the academic is, taking the benefit of being in the ivory tower. I don't think I can make this useful instantly. Maybe. I mean, it would take a lot of work to do that.
So
right?
that kind of responds to the question by another person. Do you think, based on your findings, a new perspective could be ranking or scorecard of different courts based on their decisions?
I've been in conversation with Vidhi. I have a parallel project where we worked on a very different type of policy, POXO, right? The prevention of sex crimes and children. Um, and one of the policy implications or recommendations that came from that is this type of work where you're looking at a corpus of cases across India. Yeah, we can think about scorecards for judges, scorecards for courts, and frankly, Daniel Chen, my co-author, he's been running a lot of these kinds of experiments on actual courts. So, Namita, supposing you're a judge and someone comes and shows you in an app that you show you your own performance as a judge. How many times do you rule green versus not? Make you aware of the patterns in your own decision corpus, right? Would it help you be more fair? Maybe. So, what Daniel is recommending is yes, absolutely. The answer to this is courts should take jurimetrics seriously, use these kinds of analyses, grade themselves, not grade, but create apps that can help judges like look in the mirror. What have I done? What is it counted for? How many rulings have I been pro environment or not? And it could make judges more self-aware. I mean, I'm a big fan of machine learning and AI assisting humans, not replacing humans. And I think this kind of work can make better judges, better lawyers, better courts. Sorry, I'm getting like that. I'm really excited for the question.
Yeah, and I think we have a lot of questions, but I think you should proceed and then we'll take another batch.
How much time do I have?
You have about 25.
That should be fine. So, all right, last piece of this, I would say I've covered pollution, covered mortality. There was really not much news on mortality, but firms. All right, so we matched the firms in our cases to prowess. Prowess is a large companies, right? So I guess this means that environmental litigation is largely contested by large firms, right? Which there's a paper by Rohini Pandey, and she finds something, and Esther Duflo, and they find something very similar, that the Indian CPCBs and SPCBs largely focus on big firms. They don't go after the, Sanganer block printer operating in his basement, right? Or rooftop. They don't. They go after large firms. So maybe that's why we found a third of them in prowess. I didn't think we'd find any, right? But we did. Same pattern, right? This blue is income, red is assets, green is expenses, and particularly expenses on pollution mitigation. This was asked in prowess. I couldn't believe it, right? Like, what are the odds you actually find data you like that's useful when you're doing this? And then there's liabilities. And what you can see is, and maybe you can't see it very well, I'll kind of zoom in on it, right? Again, in the filing stage, not much action, right? This is kind of BOD versus judicial orders. And what you can see, sorry, ignore my figure caption, that's wrong. This is trying to zoom in on the firm's results. Again, in the decision stage, you start to see a reduction in firm profits, a reduction in income and liabilities, income and assets, and an increase in expenses and liabilities, largely because those firms are, you see a decrease in expenses. Let me say this better. Decreased income, um, you know, and increased liabilities. And if you break it up a little more to the filing stage and the decision stage, you can see it a little more closely, right? These are firms that are actually matched in prowess, right? Not just all firms. So again, what you see is during the period that the case is being litigated, the firms change what they're doing. They're taking less profits. They're winding down some of their assets. Their, liabilities are going down. There's just a lot of less economic action in the firms, right? They're scaling down production, it seems. But after the decision date, right? After the decision date, it goes back up again.
Right.
It's like there's a ho gaya effect, right? Finished ho gaya, like go back to normal kind of thing. So, all right. So this again, CPR, you guys are very close to kind of policy making. The good news of what I'm saying is litigation does some to do. The good news is, pro-environmental rulings are reducing pollution. The effects are visible during litigation. In the paper, I also showed there's a spillover effect to neighboring districts. So to answer your audience member, if a firm was moved to a neighboring district, you do see the effect there as well. Right now, sometimes it's not neighboring, so I don't want to oversell my result. But the problem is everything rebounds after about 1 or 2 years, right? We don't see sustained improvements in water quality, and there's even evidence of increased mortality. So the problem I think we see is courts can create temporary compliance, but they just don't have the mechanisms for sustained enforcement. What is it? Like, what's the story? I think, I don't need to spend too long. We're all living in India. You know exactly what I mean here, right? Court cases filed, media, newspaper walas go, public scrutiny, the firm is shamed. Oh my God, like, this firm is dirtying the water. The firm is like, okay, I'll stop, I'll cut back, and they'll write in their annual report, their CSR, and they clean up, and they'll put a green tree on the brochure, and we're good. And then, okay, the court is like, chalo, something's improved. Let's ease up on these guys, right? Like we issue our judgment, it's a green judgment. But once attention fades, the pollution comes back, right? And lots of other people have found this in my paper on Kanpur. I found this. Greenstone Hana found this. And, Kelly Alley's work on the Ganga. And my colleague, George Shambaugh, he's a political scientist. He and I have written about this in terms of public-private partnerships. We tend to feel, or George feels, that public-private partnerships are doomed. Because in the initial years of the partnership, all attention partners are like handshaking, photos, enjoying, we're going to make a better world, pumping money in, Government of India, private firm, World Bank, they're all on the same page. But once the cameras go, who's going to pay for these things, right? Like common effluent treatment plants. Or in Jaipur, we have many. Chief ministers come, cut the ribbons, World Bank comes, but come back after 2 years, it's broken, the parts haven't come from Amsterdam, right?
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, Shireen, Shibani actually, I asked Shibani if she wanted to come in, and she wanted to come in now because she's leaving
Oh,
in
yeah,
5 minutes. So, Shibani, do you want to come in now and share
Yeah.
your thoughts with us?
Hi. Am I audible?
Yes.
Very much so.
Hi, Shireen, and hi, Namita. Namita, thanks for giving me the opportunity to speak. And Shireen, so lovely to finally see you. You are at my home. My home for 13 years. I think I can still call it, and it's unfortunate I couldn't join you today in person. But it's really nice to see your work coming together, and I wish I had an opportunity to kind of engage with this more. And I don't want to take up all the time of everyone in the room. Really interesting findings, and I'm sure we can engage on this offline at some point. But just a few thoughts on, just your past few slides about the impact of the judgments. And of course, you talk about water pollution, but many of us work on other areas of law, particularly air quality, forest conservation, where we don't, I'm not sure these kind of findings would similarly bear out. And in fact, even on water pollution, I'm just not sure whether the fact that it's gone down even temporarily is will be probably true. I know you've gone through so much and there's so many kind of indices that you've used. Or maybe it's just a litigating cynic in me who's just wondering, do we even manage to have a temporary positive impact on the ground? Or is it just something some numbers put together are able to show us in a positive light? Because I mean, if even the pollution goes down for a year, I think that's a huge victory, Shireen. And I'm not entirely sure that's happening. You're right. I mean, this media and publicity, court, there is that halla. But that halla, honestly, is for very few cases. I mean, I don't think we know about 80% of the water pollution cases in India. I mean, the media coverage is still very much urban, very much where perhaps there is a strong resident welfare association, or there's a strong NGO, or there's a strong MP or an MLA or an opposition party, something like that. So sorry, I mean, I'm just pushing you to kind of think a little more in terms of these findings. Not at all being critical, but just more curious about we'll be very happy to know if we have this kind of impact, if at all.
So, Shivani, I'll thank you for raising that, right? And I was going to bring this up at the end. You're absolutely right that this is the story that emerges from kind of massaging the numbers, right? But the truth is, look at what I'm measuring, right? I'm observing my indicator of pollution is the maximum observed value of pollution, not the average value of pollution, which is very much what you see and feel in India, right? I'm saying the worst it is over a period of a year. So that's not going to correspond to anything an average citizen perceives. And that's both a strength and the weakness of my analysis. It's a strength because the numbers are telling you something that you can't see. And it's a weakness because you can't see it, right? The second thing I would say, Shivani, is I do worry about data here. And I really worry about the pollution data. I'm very worried that monitors maybe not reliable, there's a whole political economy of data collection. In my data, there are, certain monitors that are really important where data is just missing and I have to interpolate. And that's not great, right? So you're right. This is the story the data tells, but the data itself is a political construct. And I could very well see a scenario in which there's no impact, but I'm seeing it because of certain data being selectively missing. Does that answer your question, Shivani?
Yes, I think it does. I think I think it does, Shireen. And I think let's continue speaking about this, online elsewhere. I mean, I think there's a lot I have to learn from you and your team's work. Thank you so much for the opportunity, Namita.
No, thank you for joining in, Shivani. And it is your home, and we are going to bring you back to give a talk very soon, as we've been talking as
Right.
part of the legal history series. So, folks, please read Shivani's book and
Yeah,
Kareen's
yeah. Oh, I mean,
articles
this
and
is
come for
all-
her talk.
This all came from Shivani's book. In fact, Shivani, you're the kind of parent of this paper.
Oh, dear. That's very generous and kind of you, Shireen.
And
Thank
I
you.
remember, Shivani, that when you were working on that book, we had the discussion in this room. So there's a lot of
Okay,
history.
see, the idea was
The book
born here.
chapters, this is the edited volume, right? Or-
Yes,
Yes, and
yes,
the
yes.
authors discussed it in this room. So there's a lot of history here.
But I read the
Very much the
first
parent
chapter
of that
more
book.
carefully than the rest of it. But
Thank
yeah,
you.
Shivani's point is right that, but yeah, and I have to emphasize this is the max value that is recorded at the monitor over a year. So it's like the equivalent of the Diwali air in Delhi.
Yeah.
It's not everyday air. You can have Diwali air get better, but everyday air get worse. And I won't pick that up. I'm saying the worst water quality over a year. So, but that's in the world of economics, that is an indicator we want to look at because it's how far does the firm go, right? Like how far does the firm go? So, and then we find some effect on the average, but to Shivani's point, that is so small that if she feels cynical about it, the data is consistent with that cynicism. The average doesn't change much.
Right.
So, all right. So to conclude this up, right? Again, I don't want to belabor this. I've already said all this. Why don't courts have long-term impact? I think, again, you guys know this, right? There's a certain institutional complexity in India. I remember doing some field work in Sanganer, Jaipur, right? Where if you're a block printer, you have to comply with the overlapping jurisdictions of about 7 different agencies. Each one of them has different guidelines for kind of pollution. So, right, I mean, it's very difficult to get it right if you're a firm owner in India. There's no single entity that's responsible for water quality. State pollution control boards have complex relationships. I've seen them firsthand in Rajasthan and in Goa. They could be different countries, right, in terms of how those relationships work. A lot of the firm, orders are requiring, there's this trend in India that of installing common effluent treatment plants, CTPs. There's like 90 plus of them in India. They don't, they all work great for a little while, but they don't work in the long run because they're expensive and they're very hard to maintain. And you really need shared responsibility between citizens, firms, and government. And that kind of coordination has not been there. Lastly, I would say like economics, right? Like, look, Niti Aayog 2 years ago or 3 years ago put out a pretty significant report studying some of the same policies that are in my data, and for each one arguing with evidence that I couldn't really find in the report. Like it was evidence based, but I couldn't find the data, right, in their report, saying some of the same policies that I'm studying here had devastating economic impacts, job losses, firms going out of business. And they gave examples of how citizens, in the aftermath of environmental rulings, come back to the court saying they want the firms to come back. Sterilite in Tamil Nadu restarted in the pandemic, right? Because the job losses were devastating. So,
Just on Sterilite, because there's a question from our Zoom audience on
Yeah.
Sterilite. Hello, can you hear me? Hello? Now? Is this? No, no, please, I'll just use this one. While being creative, do you think Indian judges take into account unintended consequences of their decisions? For instance, a green order to shut down the Sterlite copper Tuticorin plant allegedly had negative economic consequences on the communities and firms dependent on it.
yeah, I think that there are blind spots for sure. Remember, Indian judges are not trained in environmental law over this period because there wasn't one really, right? Like this was a new area. So, absolutely, there were blind spots. Absolutely, there were good calls and bad calls that became apparent only after the calls. Sure, but that's the case of environmental law everywhere in the world at some level, right? Because this stuff is just really complex. All right, do you want me to carry on or do you want to add more questions?
There are lots of questions, but why don't you conclude?
I'm almost done,
Yeah.
right? Okay, so I mean, I don't need to dwell on this. I think clearly what you learn from this research is environmental governance just takes more than courts, right? Courts, what can courts do? They can raise awareness, they can complement the regulator. Public interest litigation can certainly provide citizens with new opportunities to access justice. But look, a court cannot substitute for a regulator. A court cannot do monitoring and enforcement. And to your audience members' questions, look, if they pass a green order and it turns out to kill jobs and reduce GDP growth, that's what it did, right? That's the process of justice. So I think where we end up here, and I think Shivani will agree with this based on her comments, that judicial activism is very widely touted in India. The court will do this, the court will do that, but it's not going to be sufficient for environmental protection. For that, you really need institutional capacity building, right? And we can talk about this in the Q&A. I think you can guess what I mean by capacity building. You need post-judgment monitoring, you need better regulators, more sustainable solutions. You can't keep doing CETPs. That's the wrong, costly end of pipe technology. you need to kind of, if okay, and even if you're going to shut down a firm, you can't just shut it down. You've got to transition the affected workers. There's got to be job, community compensation mechanisms. This is not easy anywhere in the world, but in a context of India, the urgency for this is pretty huge, right? So our next steps with our research is really going beyond water pollution. To a small confession, if there are PhD students in the room, don't work in this area for your doctoral work. It takes so long. And the results are so hard to publish because, think about the number of data sets and the complexity. Like, if you do it anyway, kudos to you, but it's a tough field to work in. But what we're doing is, because it was so hard to study, it was so easy to study 973 cases, we decided let's go to 13,000. Right? So we're doing it. We're using ChatGPT to kind of code these cases. I have a paper in the AI computer science world validating AI with humans. We get about a 73% match. That's either good news or bad news, depending on how you feel about 73%. But we're going to do all of this for air pollution. I'll probably be back here for the next 15 years. So, but that's it basically. Happy to take questions now by email, or I can talk about this stuff at length even when I go back to the US. You can wake me up early in the morning and talk about this, and I'm excited. So
That's great. And obviously, the talk has excited a lot of questions. So, taking a few more from our Zoom audience. Sachida has asked, wouldn't you think judges getting green scores, and if they are low in score, they may become inclined towards increasing their green score and thereby not be totally impartial while adjudicating cases?
well, it could go the other way too, right? Like if your goal is development, GDP growth, job creation, then a green score could be a negative. So I don't know. It's a score is a score. How you use it, is it a score for a good thing or a bad thing, can still vary.
Right. Shrey Goel asks, given your findings on the temporary nature of judicial intervention and the power of AI in legal analysis, do you envision AI tools helping to level the playing field in environmental litigation?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I'm not a very I'm not a huge believer in the power of AI to do good in the world right now. Like if anything, I see it as a net threat, right? But in this arena of, studying Indian courts, I mean, really, we're not going to sit around. When I had 10 law students, right, I was paying them to read these cases. They were doing it because I was paying them, but the feedback I got is, ma'am, so boring. Can you give us something else to do? Most people, even law students, really don't want to sit around reading thousands of cases and quoting them. So if I look back and I can hire 10 law students, I would so much rather hire them to do something more interesting than reading cases. Instead, I'd love them to research judges, bios, there are so many tasks on our list that they could have done, but they didn't do because they were reading these cases. I'd rather have AI read them and have them develop a closer working relationship with me, learn, grow, and do higher value added things. So, my answer is in the realm of empirical legal studies. The needs are so vast that AI is actually helpful and not displacing humans yet.
Another question about AI. Could AI empower resource limited environmental groups or communities by assisting them in identifying strong cases, predicting outcomes, or streamlining case building against well resourced polluters? You've kind of answered that.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, what I want to do is, if this paper ever gets published, because that'll be validation. If it's validated, I'd love to turn it over to environmental groups and saying, guys, go use it, do stuff with it that's useful, right? Like, kuch banao iske saath. It'd be great. So.
Abhishek Priyadarshi is asking, why don't firms experience higher expenses during litigation as they might be involved in greenwashing and technological improvements? Also, can we disaggregate firms' financial results on the basis of pro-green versus anti-green ruling?
Yeah, so okay, great question. These are huge firms. Prowess is large firms typically, right? So this is like Jindal or Ambani or Daniel, that the expenses are, or that's maybe an exaggeration, right? It's maybe not that big, but certainly these are big firms and these are small cases typically. So the fact that we observe the effects we do is in some sense surprising. Even I'm skeptical. If Shibani was skeptical, she's not alone. And sorry, what was the second part of the question?
Can we disaggregate firms' financial results on the basis of pro-green versus anti-green ruling?
Yeah, not really, because I only have a couple of hundred firms, right? And that's just not enough power. You barely saw any results. The results were just squeezed out of there. They're divided into two groups. Maybe when we study air pollution.
Nutan Maurya wants to know whether the dilution of pollution in water bodies due to floods during monsoons might have an impact on the data, because we have seen that during monsoon rivers normally show cleaner water than in the pre-monsoon time.
Yeah, great question. And this should reassure you. My econometric approach has district and year fixed effects, which means that everyone's rivers get cleaner in the monsoon, right? So anything you observe is absorbed that already and is in addition to that. The seasonal variation, month by month variations are accounted for. The effects you're seeing are despite those, not driven by those.
And Rupali Sharma wants to know, can you specify which kind of unsupervised algorithm have you used for clustering? Is it k-means?
Yeah, like we've used, wait, what do you mean clustering?
That's all they say.
Okay, I mean, we've,
Maybe for the clustering of the data that, that
oh,
show is showing.
so we've done clustering in lots of different ways. One is like if an order applies in 3 districts, like say tanneries in UP, those are concentrated in 3 districts. Then we take the observations in those 3 districts and we cluster them together. We treat them as one because, they're all treated at the same time. So we correct our standard errors for the jurisdiction of the policies. Then in the actual like demographic data, of course, we cluster for district and year. So I think I'm answering the question, but I don't know what type of clustering she means.
Do we have any other questions in the room? Yeah, Devashri?
I'm Devash. I work at CPR. So I had a question because you mentioned about that CPCB and SPC, like the state and the Central Pollution Control Board typically goes after the larger firm. So in one of the work that we have been doing, I mean, there's a problem of regulation with a large number of small firms.
Yeah.
So did your sort of data set looked into, like, because you mentioned about the prowess, the large firms, so that this would have a different effect when it comes to the smaller firms? Because it's a problem that we keep on hearing, that even the code is failing and the regulatory mechanism needs to be strengthened. But at the same time, does the regulation itself allows it for the small firms? Can they do that?
I know. And there, I would love to talk to you afterwards because I can't think of the right data set. See, the right data set would have a panel. I need a panel of firms, and I want firms of all sizes. ASI is not a panel. ASI is pooled cross section. That's not going to do it for us. We need to track the firm over time. Prowess was told, I didn't even want to do it. I like fighting with my co-authors. Kuch nahi milega, don't waste your time. But we found what we found, right? So I was surprised we found anything, but because I thought the firms are too large. But we did. But yeah, I don't think we have great data right now in India, panels of small firms. I mean, do you know? Yeah.
That's a problem, I mean, because even in the databases, we find it little difficult to like how even the tanneries, like what size of tanneries, and like, wait for a
Exactly.
cluster, even in
Same
the
here.
same case, yeah.
Yeah, and even in the old days, household surveys, you could ask household enterprises and all that, but those details surveys are not there right now in a panel form. Yeah, so I think we're facing the same handicap, and ideally we want to see small firms.
Okay, so we are at time, and but we still have several questions on Zoom. Anshu, you had a question as well, yeah. Anybody else in the room? Yes, wow.
I have one.
I think we'll just have to collect all the questions now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have one input, and I would love to know what you think about it. And another is a question. So, when you were trying to understand the background of judges and how usually they write their judgments, you can include one part, with one a factor, which is a lot of judges are directly appointed from the bar, like the senior advocates becoming judges and giving certain kind of judgments. Also, they don't have a judicial training specifically, and the others, which is very less, I think it's 30% or 20% of the judges which are directly appointed as judges in higher courts from the lower judiciary. So you can see the difference how they are giving their judgments, because what I believe is that people who are lawyers becoming judges will be more more concerning or caring for the people. My question is, the scorecard or the ratings for judges and judgments that you create.
Haven't done that yet. That's like the
Okay.
aspiration. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, I have done that. Sure, sure. So carry on.
Yeah, so like who will do it and how we will put it into the system and who can use it? Because if we do that, maybe this can be used by the government or authorities to sort of track where they want to put their case in, or like.
I mean, you can already do that if you're diligent, right?
Yeah.
If you're a committed, trained environmentalist and you're filing a case,
You will know which
you
judges.
know, right? Like you talk to people who do this and they kind of know. But the first assignment is random. Once they see, they're like, "Arey, like let's stall, let's do this, let's do that." But I'm using first assignment. So, but you're right. Like I think I haven't done the scorecard. I kind of have done it, but I haven't put it in an easy to use form. But if I did, it could be used for good and it could be used for not good. That's true, but that's happening anyway.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Sorry, you
Thanks
wanted
for
to
that.
collect the questions and I
Yes.
started talking.
Because
Sorry.
we have a lot. Yes, it's working.
Hi, I'm Minakshi from the Center for Science and Environment. So I have one question that what is the long-term solution for this? Like beyond litigation, should we build the capacity of CPCB, SPCB, and PCC? And should we also involve the local community into this as watchdogs?
Okay.
Any other questions at the back? I thought there were a couple of other hands.
Hi, I'm good, Kirat. I work at the Center for Policy Research. You mentioned earlier in the presentation that the results, the effects on the infant mortality rate weren't too high. I wonder if it makes sense to rather correlate that with morbidity cases arising out of lung and you know liver-related complications, diseases which have direct implications on pollution and toxicity in water resources.
Yeah, so happy to answer. There's no data, dear. There's no morbidity. I need over a period of 20 years, year by year by year. There's just no morbidity. Even our population surveys are snapshots several years apart. Mortality is nice because I collected through pregnancy histories in NFHS surveys. So for every woman, how old were you when you lost a baby? You can calculate. I can't do that for morbidity. So that's the answer to that. On the long-term solution, yeah, exactly, right? Like I think what we need in India and everywhere is a system of shared responsibility. The state, the firm, the judge, everybody has a part to play, including us as citizens. But that's what we need. And there's too much of expectation of institutions to do it for us. Totally.
Archit had a question. You do or you don't? Okay.
Yeah, you mentioned that a third of cases that you surveyed were green. In the non-green cases, I mean, even if from the judge's writing style they have, let's say, bias towards development, they still need to find a legal reason to, turn the case non-green, right? So
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you think it's a worthwhile analysis to see, do these cases usually lose on evidence? Are these matters of procedure? Are there particular sections of, let's say, the Water Pollution Control Act that they're not able to prove? I mean, what reasons are the judges usually given?
Such an interesting question, right? So, in every case I examined, it was actually like an issue of evidence and establishing causality. people are alleging the firm is polluting, the pollution is causing illnesses in the community. Typically, you'll see the judge saying the illnesses could be caused by other factors. And the failure to meet that kind of causal evidence, that's the number one thing. Really.
Any other question? Yeah. I think we have to close and we still have some questions on Zoom. So everyone who's already asked a question, if you will be okay if I just move on to people who haven't. One from my colleague Partho is, if the worst improves but the average doesn't change much, then the better section of the distribution is also compressed. Is that an accurate reading of the distribution?
Yeah, I said that very loosely. It's not that the average doesn't move much. The average does move, but it's really the swings in the tails that we're seeing over here. So that's what's driving these results. But in the paper, we look at the mean, we look at the median, we look at smoothed, and happy to share those. But the impacts are smaller. I mean, as it is, I'm saying max pollution is going down by 24%. So think about what that means at the average, right? Once you kind of control for that. So yeah, the result is there, but it's just very small.
Okay, and then I'm just going to read out the questions and maybe you can decide
Okay.
which ones to answer. Have you seen any trends or specific distinctions in PILs and contempt of court judgments and environmental violations involving violations of court orders?
No, because I'm not convinced I've got the right set of PILs. Like again, the court, the e-court system and the Kanun system, it doesn't flag what's a PIL. So I have to look for the keyword. But I know there are PILs where they don't use the term PIL in the write-up of the case. So then I actually am wondering, can anyone ever do a great study of PILs if we don't even know what the PILs are? And again, this could be like Indians sitting abroad doesn't know of something basic problem, but I've asked a lot of people and nobody seems to have a database of PILs.
Yeah. Vivek wants to know, where is this expectation that courts should do governance coming from specifically for the environment? Is it just a general public expectation from courts, or is there something specific about environment?
Oh, I mean, I think that's just coming from, if you look at the literature on India, people's faith in the executive and legislature is pretty low, but their faith in the judiciary has historically, over this sample period, been pretty high.
Right.
And it's the tone of the hearings and the newspaper articles. I think Indians have looked to the courts. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but that was the prior.
Okay, and I'm going to skip a couple of questions that are pretty much related to what's been asked. And Nirmal John wants to know, do court rulings which give recognition of rivers or water bodies as juristic persons or entities have some impact in deterring pollution in those rivers? I think they're referring to the Uttarakhand High Court judgment, which called Ganga a living
A
entity.
living entity. I don't know. I haven't looked into that.
Right.
Great question.
Do you want to quickly ask your question as well? And then I'll just.
Happens is that even if there is evidence for water pollution, the court might impose a penalty, which then another court might stay saying that this is too high. Where did you get this penalty from? And the Supreme Court has tried to remedy this by saying that you can have 1% of the turnover as a penalty. The idea is that the penalty should be high enough to be a deterrent, right? So I feel like this is a huge issue in India, that courts are simply not able to understand how much to make companies pay. And because that's really all they can do, they can issue orders. So what is the right punishment in terms of like environmental economics that will help enforcement is what I was trying to say.
So this is a great last question, right? So there's a great book by Andre Schleifer, The Economist, right? Where I think, I forget what it's called, and I'm not connected to the internet, so I can't, but it's the argument. Hold on, I'm pretty sure I've cited it in my paper, so maybe I'll be able to pull it up. Maybe come to me afterwards and I'll put it. But Andre Schleifer's book basically argues courts should not do this. This is, I think it's called The Failure of the Judge and the Rise of the Regulator. What he basically argues is exactly your point, that judges cannot do this. The body of technical knowledge you need to dip into. The study I've done, you need to do something like this for every case to get it right, and that's never going to happen. So that's a great case for never needing to go to the court in the first place. Get the regulator empowered, funded, so that you don't end up in the court. It's called the emergent. He argues that regulation emerged in the Western world precisely from the failure of judges. The Coase theorem thing doesn't work, right? So you've got to get regulation right.
So I'm just going to end with some thoughts for you to sort of take forward your research. Obviously, this has been just fascinating, tremendous amount of work that you've done, and it's going to be really useful for all of us who look at court cases. But wanted to share some insights from my own work. So our research on land acquisition in 2017 when we published that, and it was we looked at 3,000 cases from which we had selected 1,269 cases that we found were relevant for the analysis. And that was one body of work. Before that, I had done this work on health rights litigation in 2010, which was evaluating a similar question as what you're doing here with environmental cases, is that really what happens to the right to health, like what happens after the judgments, right? And there was a previous work by and it's so interesting because and speaks to the importance of what CPR has managed to create over the years, because not only was Shibani's book discussed in this room, your paper's been discussed in this room, but also when we were working on this health rights work, Pratap Bhanu Mehta, who was the former president of CPR, and Shaileshri Shankar, who were faculty here, had published a paper as part of Varun Gauri's edited collection on courts and social and economic rights. And they had looked at education and health cases. And they had also coded them according to various codes and so on. But when I and Sharanjit Parmar, my co-author, when we put out a study on the right to health litigation, we disagreed with them on many of the classifications, and so did Madhav Khosla, who was also here at CPR, and went on to do a PhD as well at Harvard. He also, in his work, basically, there is a lot that is there in just the classifications and the coding exercise that is going on, right? So, for example, in their classification of education and health cases, for instance, they had only thought that cases brought by NGOs were in the public interest, right? But because we did a qualitative reading of the cases, we realized that many cases that were of public interest actually came from individual petitions, and any lawyer will tell you that. MC Mehta himself was an individual petitioner, right? So that really changed the analysis of how much of it was private individual health claims, because the book that we were working on, which was on the right to health, was really called "Can Courts Bring Justice to Health?" question mark, which is exactly what you're asking. Can courts bring justice to environment, right? And this was a multi-country study, and in countries in South America, like Brazil and Colombia, there was a lot of evidence of how the right to health was being used to sort of further private treatments under their specific legal mechanisms. But in the Indian context, we didn't find that, because even the individual cases were usually bringing, other than a certain set of cases which were about government healthcare claim reimbursements, most of them were actually bringing attention to a larger public health issue, even if it started as an individual case. The other thing that we found in that study was that it was very hard, as you rightly said, to find data on population impacts, but we found a significant impact on policy. And this has actually been a major part of my work, starting from the health rights work to the land work. And of course, a couple of years ago during COVID, I published a paper on the human right to water, because the human right to drinking water as an international human right came about in 2010, and it was on the strength of the development of the right to water in many domestic contexts. So often it is the international courts, so the international law guiding domestic law, but in the case of the right to water, it was the opposite, because we had domestic jurisdictions developing the right to water that had then led to the recognition of a human right to water in 2010. And for that, I looked at all the right to water cases. Water pollution is a subset of the cases that came up as part of the right to water cases. A lot of them are cases about irrigation and easement and all those other kinds of cases. So anyways, putting the findings from these like 3-4 bodies and data sets together, I would say a few things. First is that in the health rights context, all major policy decisions, whether it was about provision of emergency medical care, whether it was of actually doing the regulatory work of having drugs regulation, regulation of availability of blood supply. All these policies were framed pursuant to court orders and court-appointed committees that went then on to draft policies that are impacting the population at large. So I would say, I don't know, we couldn't say about population impacts, but definitely in terms of policy, the courts were setting the policy agenda in a situation where, as you said, the legislature and the executive were largely absent in their responsibility, and this is how citizens were able to. So I do think it was a significant impact. Because that policy shaped the changes for generations, right? So, and I think time is also important for measuring what happens with a court decision and how long does it take to translate into policy. And for instance, and also legislative changes, because we had a right to health bill that was drafted pursuant to the judgments of the Supreme Court and the High Courts. That bill remained pending with the union government, but the state of Rajasthan has, about a year or two ago, enacted the Right to Healthcare Act. It is the first state in the country to do so. We saw similar things with the right to food case, with the right to education law. These very important rights-based legislation have come about, or the right to fair compensation and transparency in land acquisition, rehabilitation, and resettlement act. Anshu and I just come back from fieldwork in Madhya Pradesh, where we were studying the Narmada Bachao Andolan's work and in securing not only compensation but also rehabilitation and resettlement for project affected communities. And it was the Narmada Bachao Andolan struggle, which of course happened on the ground, but also used the courts, and also used all machinery that was available to them, as social movements do, is what led to actually the right to fair compensation and rehabilitation and resettlement law as it finally came about like a decade later. So there's a significant impact of court-based interventions on policy and on legislation, which obviously has huge population impacts, right? Because then you can use that legislation to actually hold people accountable in the future. But these changes happen over time. So, for example, the right to health study we did was in 2010. The first right to healthcare law, and it's not by Rajasthan, has come about 20 into 2023, I think it came into effect. So we have to, the time effects. The next thing I would say is the importance of the interim orders. I'm always like, whenever people say court judgments do not make that much of a difference, I always ask them, what is the counterfactual, right? There is the very fact that we are even able to have this conversation in this room today is because of the courts and because of the interim reliefs that we've got. And the very fact that much of I was asking one of the questions that we were asking in this project where we are studying both dam and mining displacement. And what is, so I asked them, how do you evaluate success, right? And the success is that they were able to delay the project by 25 years and in the process also get better compensation and rehabilitation and resettlement. Obviously, this isn't about environment, but it is also about the environment because, one of the major arguments that the Narmada Bachao Andolan used was the fact that this was bad for the environment, bad economically, bad for the people, everything, right? So again, it's very hard to sort of decipher these things. And I was under the impression, partly because of the literature that has been written by academics, that the Narmada Bachao Andolan ultimately failed because much of the literature has focused only on the Sardar Sarovar project. But there are 30 large dams in the Narmada Valley, and we visited a dam which actually was taken to construction and then it was not operational. And the people had never been displaced because of their struggles. So there are all these stories that are probably not there in the data, but it is important to study the translation into policy and then maybe economists can tell me better how do we evaluate the impacts of policy, because things like emergency medical care, the fact that blood banks are following certain policies in the way blood is being made available affect like 1 billion people. So I would say that court judgments are pretty significantly impacting people in positive ways in those cases. And finally, on the pollution stuff, which is why I'm a big votary of qualitative and quantitative analysis, is for example, these 4 case studies that we are studying of successful cases, how do you evaluate the fact that an entire village is not displaced by one judgment versus like one project that might be, basically the size and scope of some of these cases is so huge. Or the Samata case, where we actually saw this entire hill that was saved from mining. An entire hill was saved from mining. And what are the, and it's like green and lush and beautiful 25, 30 years later. And what are the effects that that has on the flow of water in the area? The fact that pollution, it prevented pollution, apart from displacement and so on. And it really brings back the question of, which I think is the larger philosophical question, is that human beings, and which is also core to my work, is that human beings are not separate from the environment, right? And that is really the concept of that we are part of the environment, and so to study cases as green or go green whenever we are not really whenever we see ourselves as separate from the environment is when these kinds of questions can come in. But and then of course the question of whose environment, right? Because there are always different stakeholders in all of this. So but thank you so much.
Well, thank you. And for those of you in the room, what's so interesting is the contrast between Shivani and your views, right? I'm somewhere in the middle, but that's amazing at CPR. You have this range of debates. I love it. So,
Yeah, thank you all for the such a patient and engaged. We've had such a patient, engaged audience
Yeah,
with lots
really.
of questions. Please do write to Shireen if you have more questions, and please visit us. Come back.
Of course, of course. And yeah, honestly, write to me. There's a 10-hour time difference, which means I'll read your emails early, but I will respond.
Yeah.
If it's on this, always. So.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking